Hi, everybody, and welcome to Oracle Cloud World. My name is Christian Shay, and I'm a product manager here at Oracle for Visual Studio and Microsoft Visual Studio Code. And today we're going to talk about PL/SQL debugging for those of you who are using those IDEs in your day-to-day work. This will help you get started. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to introduce a couple of our extensions that we have that are free for those two environments. And then I'm going to go over a high-level overview of how PL/SQL debugging works in general, just so you know. And then after we get through that, I'm going to do a detailed demo before we wrap it up. So let's get started. All right, so let me introduce Oracle Developer Tools for VS Code. So this is a free extension. It's available in the Visual Studio Marketplace. And it runs on, it's multi-platform, open source, and it runs on Linux, macOS, and Windows. So once you install that, you're going to be able to explore your Oracle databases and autonomous databases. You're going to be able to manage your autonomous databases. And you can do all the things you would expect, such as edit and execute SQL and PL/SQL. And then as you're coding, you get autocomplete, you get IntelliSense. And then the reason we're here today is we integrate with Visual Studio Code's awesome debugger. So we're a first-class citizen in their debugger world, and if you already know how to debug in VS Code, you already know mostly how to debug with Oracle. And then a few other things that I just want to comment on. We have really nice support for coding features like hover, go to definition, go to implementation. And there's a lot of other features. I encourage you to try it out. I'll show you how in a minute. Now, for those of you who are using Windows and Visual Studio, we also have an extension for that environment called Oracle Developer Tools for Visual Studio. So again, this is free in the Visual Studio Marketplace, and you can edit and execute PL/SQL and SQL. We also have a tightly integrated debugger. That's why we're here today. And you can explore your autonomous database and manage it. We have script editing and generation. We have schema compare tools and also source control integration. So I'll show both of these products at the end here and during the demo. So let's talk about PL/SQL debugging. I would like to give you a high-level overview of it because it's not exactly straightforward, but once you understand it, it's pretty easy to understand. All right, so the PL/SQL debugging architecture, you have a debugger, for example, Visual Studio Code. And you have, of course, an Oracle database. All right. So you're going to connect through your tool or your debugger. You're going to connect to the Oracle database like you normally would, connect username, password. Okay. But upon connection, if debugging is enabled, we're also going to send the host or IP address and the port of your Visual Studio machine or your Visual Studio Code machine. Because what happens is the Oracle database turns around and connects right back to Visual Studio using that host IP and port to start the debugging session. So once that second connection is established, now debugging begins, and Visual Studio Code sends requests to the database about where they are in the code, etc. And Oracle database actually does most of the work of maintaining the state of the debugging session, such as what line you're on, what the variable values are, what locals you want, and stuff like that. So, for example, step to next line. It goes back and forth to the database to take care of that. What are the local variable values? Or set breakpoint here. So the important thing to take away from this is the database has got to be able to know how to and be able to connect back to your Visual Studio machine, Visual Studio Code machine. And sometimes firewall issues or other shenanigans can get in the way of that. So it's just important to understand that everything is not happening on your local machine. The database is doing a great deal of work, and there's a second connection involved. Okay, so what do you need to do to get started debugging PL/SQL? Well, first of all, you need to have certain grants, certain privileges. So these are some of the, on your screen here, these are some of the grants that will need to be supplied. And you don't have to memorize all this. We make it very easy from inside the tool to do this. But more importantly is the access control list, because the database has got to connect back to your local machine. So it has to be in the access control list. So there is a somewhat complicated block of PL SQL that has to be executed to achieve this. And this is actually, again, made easy by the tools, and I'll show you how to do that when we get to the demo. So there's a couple ways you can do debugging. One way is to just look at your PL SQL in Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code and just step into it. That's probably the simplest scenario. And so first thing you need to do is tell Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code the IP and port range that you wish to use. You need to compile your PL SQL for debug mode. And this is very easy. From both of these, we have a compile debug menu option. You need to set breakpoints in your PL SQL code, of course. And also because sometimes it's flying around and you may not realize what's going on before you're completely out of the program. And then you start debugging. You can you can run debug from the menu. And finally, you do your debugging. So that's the simplest case, and I'll show you how to do that in just a second. Another complicated case, but one that everyone here is probably going to be doing, is if you have an application, say a Python application or a Java application or a .NET application that's calling into PL SQL, and you want to pass live data, for example, an array of 10,000 values, to your stored procedure or function. And let's suppose that one of those values in the array causes a bug. How do you catch that in the act? Well, this is how you do it. So you want to debug your application at the same time you're debugging PL SQL. And so again, you need to tell the debugger what the IP and port you should use. You need to configure the application calling the PL SQL by telling it what your host and your port is. And you need to do this before connecting to the database. If you can't do it before you connect to the database, then you'll have to use the DBMS debug JDP package to enable PL SQL debugging after the connection's established. And this is well documented, but there's a connect TCP member to that package where you supply your IP or host name and the port. Then you compile the PL SQL, you set the breakpoints in the PL SQL, you start the PL SQL debugger, and finally you run your application. And when your application calls the PL SQL, the breakpoint will fire and stop inside of the PL SQL debugger, and you'll be able to debug what's happening with your live data. So if that sounds a little bit overwhelming, don't worry. You'll see it in action in just a moment here, and it'll make a little bit more sense. So let's go ahead and move along now to the demo, and I'm going to start with Visual Studio Code, and we'll use several languages so that nobody will be left out, and then we'll move along to Visual Studio. Okay, I have Visual Studio Code here. I happen to have a Python application, but you can be working on anything, of course. So let me first introduce our extension. So if you come to the marketplace and just type Oracle, you can easily install our extension here. And it only takes a matter of a minute at the most likely. So once you get it installed, then you can proceed. And by the way, at the end of this session, I will give you a link to a walkthrough I did for Visual Studio Code. So it's kind of like this video, but in text form, in case you'd prefer to read through these steps rather than watch them on a video. Okay, so let's see. So one of the things that you get when you install this extension is you are able to connect to the database. We have connection dialogues and everything. But in the interest in time, I'm already connected here. So I have let me close a couple windows here. And so I have a package here I'm kind of interested in. I'm going to debug it, called OraMag for historical reasons, but it's a prime number tester application, basically, written in PL SQL. So let's take a look at it. Okay, so here it is in Visual Studio Code, and you can edit this and run it and all these things that you would expect to do with Visual Studio Code. But today we're going to focus on the debugging functionality. So this is a routine that takes one of the routines takes an array of input values and outputs an array of output values. And for each of the input values, it checks to see if it's a prime number and returns 0 or 1 if it is in the output array. And so, this is only going to be like a 10 element array, but you could imagine that it was, 10,000 elements, and one of them is causing you problems. And so this would be pretty powerful to be able to do this kind of debugging. Okay, so the first thing you need to do is set up debugging. So let's do that. So you come up here and you can choose PL SQL Debugger and compiler settings. So the first thing you need to do is tell it the host IP address and the port number range you're going to be using so that it can send it to the database at connect time and make sure the database can connect back to you. Okay. The next thing you need to do is this is only needs to be done one time, but you need to grant those privileges and you need to set up that ACL. So let's open up a new SQL file, and the way this extension works, it's automatically connected to Oracle using this connection, and it's using our extension as well. So let me paste it. So you can see that it's connecting as sys, it's issuing a couple grants, and then it's doing the ACL here. So I happen to have the ACL, a real ACL, here in the bookmarks. So just so you can see what it looks like when it's properly filled out. So you can see that I provided the host name, the port number, and the username that's going to be doing the debugging. So you need to execute this. I'm not actually going to do it right now because I've already done it, but you need to execute that. Okay. And then once you've done that, you'll need to compile your application for debug. So that's easy enough. You just say compile debug, and you can see it does the proper alter down here. And now you'll notice that the icons have a DBG icon. I think I'll zoom in at this point so you can see that little DBG icon. We do that because there's a little bit of a performance hit for compiling like this, and we want to remind you that you need to compile it normally to turn this off when you don't care anymore about debugging. It doesn't, that's the only effect is on performance. So once you've done this, now I can set a breakpoint, or I can just step into, let me just set one for fun. And so you pick the routine that you're interested in and you say step into. And a few things I want to point out here is in the output window, you can see that, let me see if I can zoom in on that. You can see it tells you what port it's listening on, and it just tells you that the status of the debugging session. So, and it says, look, a database is already connected back. So I'm going to go ahead and pass in the number 13. And then boom, since I did a step into, it just starts right there at the beginning of the application. And I can move through here. I can look at variables that I have there. I can look at the call stack, but I'm going to zoom through this to get to the end, and you can see that it returned a 1 as a value. So this is interesting, but maybe not the most compelling thing in the world, because if you have array elements like we do, you can't really type those in by hand. So this has limited use, right? So the real killer feature here is if you have an application. So with that in mind, now let's go over to the Python application. So this is a Python application. You can use thick or thin Python. Everybody these days is moving to thin Python. I happen to be using thick here, but both will work. And so you can see that I am connecting to this database, and I am executing OR mag determine primes after setting up the array to pass in of numbers that I want to find out if they're prime or not. Then when it's done, I scroll through them and I output whether or not it's a prime or not. Okay, so before we start this is a key piece of information that you'll need to know. We talked about the Aura debug JDWP environment variable. So the nice thing about VS Code is they have a launch.json file that's specifically used for debugging. And you can easily set environment variables here. So what you need to do is you need to set Aura debug JDWP with using this format: host equals and port equals. You need to set it to the to the host and the port that the debugger is going to be listening on. Okay, so what let me tell you some about that. So in order to do that, you need to manually start the debugger. Okay, so we're going to come here and we're going to say start external application debugger. Now, most of the time, it's going to choose that first port from the list that you gave it here in the PL SQL debugger and compiler settings. But if you're going to be doing this a lot, I recommend that you just limit that to one port so it doesn't somehow jump to the next one. It usually doesn't, because you need to put that port number in the launch.json. So if you just use one port in the settings, then you'll know that's what it's going to use. Okay, you can see that it is listening on 12001 and port 6500, and that's what we have here for the launch.json. Great, so we're in good shape. A lot of moving parts here. I might have forgotten something, hopefully not, but let's go ahead and put a breakpoint here in the determine primes routine. Okay, so the debugger is listening, it's running here. You can see the little control. Now we need to run the Python debugger. So I've already installed the required Python extensions. There's a bunch of them, and there's one for debugging as well. You have to install all that, but it has nothing to do with our extension. It's about Python debugging. And so if you're using Python, you probably already have it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say start debugging. Okay, so you can see I'm now at the point where it's going to make that call and pass these values in. Okay, so let me press the step into key. And there we are. Now we're in PL SQL. And if you take a look, you can see that those are the out values. Let's see if we can get the in values here. Let's add them as a add to watch. So we can look at them and we can see, oh, there's those values that we passed in earlier right here. There they are. Okay, and I'll probably hit this breakpoint if I go further. Let's see. Yep, there I am. I'm down in prime, and hit F5 to go back and forth. You can see that the return value is growing, 0 and 1. Okay, do it a few more times, and we should. If I set a breakpoint here, yes, I did. See, I put a breakpoint after this so it doesn't go flying past it. So let's keep going here till we get to the end. And there we are. We've come back out into Python. So I'm sure you can see the power of doing something like this. And you can do the same thing with .NET as well. So for example, if I have another project, a very similar project, let me stop debugging here. So each time that I open a new project, I'm going to have to reset here, but I have one for C# that's very similar. Right here. So this is another call to determine primes, passing in 1 through 10 and executing. Okay, come here to the tree control. Sorry for the slight delay in making the connection. Okay, very interesting. There it is. All right, so now I can start external application debugging again. Verify it's 127.001 and port 65,000. And then again, I'll go back to this project and show you the launch JSON. You can see I've got Aura debug JDWP set to host and port. So this should be good enough to get going. So now we shall start debugging the C# application. I'm using Oracle Data Provider for .NET Core, in case it matters, as the data provider for this particular application. You can see it up here at the top. So let me hit F5. All right, now when I step step in here, it should stop if I set a breakpoint. I can't remember if I did. I'll just go and cross my fingers. I guess I forgot to set that breakpoint. Let's go in there and look. Okay. Actually, I didn't even open up the. I didn't even open up this, so it's a ridiculous mistake there. So let's set the breakpoint and let's try again. So stop debugging of C#. Start debugging of C#. And then we'll step in here and hopefully we'll end up in PL SQL. And there we are. We're back in PL SQL again, looking at the input values. And we can run to the end 10 times. And we're back out in C#. Last but not least, Java. So let me go ahead and stop debugging here. We're going to have to go through that process of reconnecting again, unfortunately, but I have a demo here. Let me close all these. Okay, so I have a Java application here. And I want to show you all these because Java is a little bit of a different animal when it comes to PL SQL debugging, and I'll explain in just a second. So let's just do what I didn't do for C#. Okay. What I didn't do for C# is I didn't go in and open up the PL SQL and set a breakpoint. That would really help, wouldn't it? Okay. Open package body, set the breakpoint. Actually, in this Java app, I think I'm just calling is prime. So let's set the breakpoint there. So you can see in this app, I am setting up a call to Oremag is prime and executing it. Okay. Now, the thing that's different about JDBC, the JDBC driver, is it does not look at the environment. So it can't see your Ora debug JDWP environment variable. So what that means is you have to use this dbms debug JDWP connect TCP command call to start the debugging. And you just pass it the host name and the port number where Visual Studio is, and that's all it takes. You can write it in code like I did here, or you can create a PL SQL wrapper function or procedure around the one that you're interested in debugging and make this call inside the wrapper. You probably don't want to edit the actual PL SQL itself and put this in there because anybody else who calls it will trigger this and they'll get an error because your debugger may not be running. So any case, let's go ahead and start the debugger here. Okay, and you can see there's the host and port again. And then we will go back to Java here and we'll start debugging. So start debugging. Oh, I need to enter the password. I did it right. Entered the correct password, and I did. So here is the call to is prime. So we'll go ahead and hit step into, and here we are. We're inside of the is prime routine, debugging it. So I'm going to go ahead and fly back out of this and back into the Java routine. And you can see that the value returned of Oremag is prime is 1. Okay, there's a lot more about that, but I'll provide a link to my blog that has a step-through walkthrough so that you can see a few of the other scenarios that you might be interested in. But this is probably the most powerful way you can do debugging with VS Code. All right, so let's move along now to Visual Studio. I seem to have two instances here. Let me see which one I want to use. Okay, that looks all right. Okay, so let me go full screen here. And okay, a few things about configuration with this. So we have a tools options menu. Oh, before I do that, excuse me, let me just show you the extension so you know where to get it. So if you come in here to manage extensions and you just type Oracle, you will see Oracle Developer Tools for Visual Studio. At the time of this recording, we didn't support Visual Studio 2022. Very shortly after Open World, this should be available to you. So if you're on Visual Studio 2022 and you don't see our extension here, you'll have to wait a little bit until it's released for that version of Visual Studio. Okay, so in any case, we do have, once you have it installed, you'll see that you can connect in Server Explorer. And we do have some options for this extension under Oracle Developer Tools, PL SQL Debugging. So if you have multiple connections, the first thing you have to do is tell it which of the connections here in Server Explorer that you're going to be using when you debug. And you also need to provide the IP address and port numbers. Very similar. Then you also will need to provide, if you need to do the grants and the ACL, you can go in as sys, right-click on the schema, the user you're interested in, and choose Grant Debugging Privileges. So this will do a debug connect session, a debug any procedure, and it will also do the ACL, which you could also just cut and paste it from this window. And then coming back to the HR here, you can see that the icons have that debug logo, just like in VS Code. And we also have compile debug, and we have step into, just like we did before. So so just a few things here. So we can say step into, like I did before. I think I didn't put a breakpoint here, so let me stop and go do that here. Okay, excuse me. Let me put the breakpoint here. I guess I need to open up the package body. So let me put a breakpoint here, and then we can step into it. Provide a value, and then you can see that we are running through it, and you can look at locals. You can set watches. I can say add watch. Some of these things are not correct, but in any case, and then when you finish, it gives you the result. And then similarly, I have a ODP Oracle Data Provider for .NET application that's setting up a call to the array. So what I can do, we have a nice feature called Oracle Application Debugging. And what this does is it injects that Aura Debug JDWP environment variable into your application's environment so that you don't have to do it. So if you click that, now, as long as I have that breakpoint set, I believe I do. Yes, I do. You can go from, you can just start debugging this. Start debugging my C# application. Okay, and when I execute it, hopefully it'll pop out. Yes, it does. So here we are now in the determined primes application. I didn't even have to start the debugger or anything automatically. That's what application debugging does for you. Finally, the very last thing you can do is to actually start the debugger manually like we did with VS Code. So let me move through here to finish, pop out on the C# side. Okay. And if you want to run the application separately or have two instances of Visual Studio, you can start your, let me turn that off. You can start the external application debugger manually, like we did in VS Code. So I'm going to provide the port that I want it to listen on, and it'll just sit here listening. It'll just sit here listening. So now what I'm going to do is I have a, hopefully I have the, no, I don't have it. So let me see. Well, I can show you my blog because that's the easiest way to get access to, let me scroll down here to where I talk about this environment variable. So it's easy to copy and paste it from here. So let me just go ahead and set that. So that's in the environment. Now this is the build area for my app. So I'm just going to run the app here. And when it hits, it should fire the breakpoint, and it does. And you could do it with any app, actually, web apps or SQL Plus or anything. You can put that into the environment, and you can just start a debugger running here using external application debugging and wait for the breakpoint. Okay, so that was a lot of material in a very short time. Please check out my blog, and then you will be able to walk through it yourself. So my blog, I put a bit.ly link here to make it a little easier for you to type it in if you're watching the video. But that's the link to my blog. And then you can go to the Visual Studio Marketplace and search for Oracle Developer Tools for VS Code or Oracle Developer Tools for Visual Studio. We have a nice forums, 2 different forums, one for each of the extensions. And then here's a few links for those of you who are coming from the Visual Studio side, interested in .NET. We do have quite a few .NET resources available. And I just wanted to promote our Oracle ACE program because we're, especially in the group that works on .NET and works on Visual Studio, we were looking for experts who are interested in doing this. So if you're interested, check out the ace.oracle.com website. And with that, I would like to thank you for spending your time with me to learn about PL SQL debugging. I hope after you're done watching here, you'll go download the extension, read the blog, and give it a try.